Senator Paul, please, what is going on with TikTok? You have written, I have an article here, if they ban TikTok, is Apple next? But from all I read is, okay, hey, China owns this app and they're taking your data and we should ban it, case closed, and deals passed. Is it as simple as that?
I think it's probably one of the most egregious affronts to the First Amendment in memory. You know, the idea that 170 million people express themselves on TikTok daily, dance videos, this and that, but all kinds of stuff. 170 million Americans express themselves, and Congress now sees fit to say, wow, we're going to ban this because it has Chinese ownership. But even the accusation of Chinese ownership isn't exactly accurate. About 60% of the people who own TikTok are international investors. The board for TikTok is 3 out of 5 of them are Americans. And so really, I think there will be a First Amendment challenge in the court, but I think there'll also be a Fifth Amendment challenge in the sense that I don't think you can take someone's property in America without due process. Now, the other side will say, well, under a 2017 law, the Chinese could scrape their data. Well, apparently everybody scrapes everybody's data. If you work with Google or Facebook or any of these companies, they're all scraping your data all the time. In fact, it's part of how the internet works. If I like a certain pair of shoes and I order them, I'll get more advertisement for shoes. That's the way the internet works. But to say somehow TikTok is different than every other internet company is really just false.
But what did they do? I'm still waiting for this. I'm hearing they could do this. They might do that. Hypothetically, have they done anything? Has TikTok done anything wrong?
Most of it's been jumping to a conclusion. So I was interviewed on one of the broadcast cable stations, and they immediately said, well, the Chinese Communist government owns them. Well, that's a direct falsehood, and you can't say stuff like that, apparently. At least I didn't think you could say stuff on television that was verifiably false. But then their next step is either they're owned by a communist, which is not true, or then they say, well, the communists could take that data, that personal data. But there's no evidence that they have. And the thing is, if it's an accusation, in our country, an accusation is the beginning of due process, but you have to then prove that in court, and a jury has to agree to your guilt before you take someone's property. Now, the hawks on this issue just simply say, well, it's national security exemption to the First Amendment. I wasn't aware there was a specific national security exemption to the First Amendment or the Fifth Amendment. So I think there's a great deal of problems. I mean, federal courts have already struck down these bans 3 times. So I think it's very likely that this will be struck down. But to me, it's sort of foolish to sort of, think that the First Amendment can be abrogated if we don't like other people or like what they're saying. I have no idea everything that's expressed on TikTok. I may like some of it, I may dislike some of it, but it doesn't give me the right to ban it.
Senator, I'm really concerned about the slippery slope, because if using the same logic, you could say Honda and Toyotas are Japanese owned and they collect data, so therefore we should ban them. Like, where does it potentially end?
Even more directly on target is Apple. So the 2017 law in China says that the communist government has the right to suck up all this data. Well, they've had trouble enforcing it on companies that aren't in China, but Apple sells their telephones, the iPhone, in China. So Apple agreed to store all the data on everybody that uses a Chinese iPhone on government servers. So here's an example of the 2017 law actually being implemented on Apple, and Apple has to do this. Now, I'm not proposing we should ban Apple. What I'm saying is that the law they've written could actually apply to Apple, because Apple already is under the influence or under the control, at least for their Chinese operations, under this law. There's no evidence TikTok has done any of this, but there is evidence that Apple has done it. So I'm afraid that if we pass this law, which actually we have now passed, that it could be applied to Apple someday. And you're right. Once upon a time in the 1980s, everybody hated Japan. Now things have changed, but people were worried. They wanted to ban Japan from buying and owning things. Japan owned, Rockefeller Center, and people were up in arms. And now it's funny how times change. In my state, in Georgetown, Kentucky, Toyota employs 20,000 Kentuckians, and we're quite happy to have Japanese investment. They own Jim Beam, for goodness sakes.
Right.
We are happy to have Japanese investment in Kentucky, and times have changed. And I would like to see those times change again for China, because the more we rattle the cages and more we try to separate ourselves, I think the more likely we are to come to military blows eventually.
So you mentioned this, I think this is such an important thing about this foreign investment. We need foreign investment in our country. It's been one of the reasons we've been such a wealthy, prosperous, and successful nation. And so I think about trying to attract foreign capital, and where is foreign capital really going to want to go? It's going to want to go into technology, right? That's one of the hottest sectors on the planet. But is this potentially going to have a chilling effect of finding these foreign dollars and investments in technologies that we need? Is this now a reason to stay away from the United States and actually put us at a competitive disadvantage?
Yeah, and we have to realize that trade with China has done a couple things. They brought cheaper consumer items to us. The average Walmart shopper saves $1,000 a year shopping at Walmart, largely because of international trade. And the other thing is that over time, if we are to abolish that trade, the disadvantages to us. We also sell a lot of agricultural products to China. China also buys our debt. China owns about $1 trillion worth of our debt. Well, I'm not a big fan of adding more debt. When you do have debt, someone's got to buy it. And if we were to have, people at this rapid separation, so if we were to have this separation, it's going to hurt our agriculture. It's going to hurt the sale of our debt. It's going to hurt consumer items that you buy that are less expensive here, and ultimately hurt our standard of living. But ultimately, even worse than all of that, is that it brings more tension and more possibility of military conflict. Look, there are things I'm not happy with China. I've been an outspoken critic of the Wuhan lab and the possibility that COVID came from there. I'll continue to be that, but I'm not for ending trade with China, mainly because I don't want war, and I do see advantages to us from international trade.
So another question I have that I'd love your insight on, and I know people watching this it's just perplexing for us. We have a border crisis that has been going on for years, and no one can seem to get legislation passed on it. And in seemingly 72 hours, it goes from zero to law passed on this. What happened that this bill could move so fast through the House and the Senate when all these other pressing issues just languish?
Mike Johnson. I mean, we have a Speaker of the House who really, I think, has been a very good speaker if you're a Democrat. He allowed a $1.5 trillion spending package to go through. He blocked a warrant requirement for FISA, for this foreign intelligence court. Americans will still be subject to abuse by FISA because of Mike Johnson. And then he rushed through this Ukraine aid. Many of these things he had differing positions on immediately, and I think that's the big problem. But really, it's both parties. When people talk about a uniparty, it's the Republican leadership and the Democrat leadership. There's no difference. They care more about Ukraine's borders than they do our own. But ultimately, they aren't really conscious of the fact that sending this money to Ukraine makes our country weaker. And, they rushed through the TikTok ban and all of that hysteria, but it wasn't well thought out. I think the courts, in all likelihood, will strike it down. But we have to be wary of hysteria. When people get up in arms, as a physician, I tell people they would teach us when someone's struggling and someone's unconscious, the first thing you do is check your pulse before you check the pulse of the victim, because you can't be hysterical if you're going to take care of them. You have to think things through. What are the basics? Airway, breathing, circulation. What are the things we do? And I'm afraid with China, everything's been thrown out the door, and there's this mass hysteria. And they also don't realize they're going to be hurting American investors, but also 20% of the investors in TikTok actually are employees. I think 7,000 of them are American employees in the U.S. who are actually working for TikTok. So I think it was a rush to judgment. That's definitely true. Do
you think at boardrooms across the country, you have CEOs that are now saying, hey, we could go to Washington, claim our competitor is doing something with some foreign something or another, and try and get some market share given to us by the federal government? Is there a rent-seeking problem here?
Is there? Yes, absolutely. Look at what they're doing to Apple through antitrust right now. They're going after Apple through antitrust. And who is going after them? It's the people who actually, Apple has digital wallets. So all the banks are coming to Washington and they're saying, or anybody has a competing digital wallet, wants to compete and wants to force Apple to have their product sold on there. And Apple says, no, we've got a product, our digital wallet, we're selling it. But you can see how all their competitors come and they use antitrust to try to beat them up. I would say the majority of the antitrust law is disgruntled competitors trying to use government to get an economic edge from someone who's selling a better, cheaper product than they have.
Well, that's something I always thought was fascinating about TikTok and Zoom during the COVID shutdowns, was that we always heard that Facebook and all these other companies have these monopolies, and then boom, it seemed like overnight 2 new technologies were out there competing with the existing technologies. And so part of me wonders how much of this may be other competitors saying, hey, we want to try and regain some market share that we lost virtually overnight.
Yeah, and the bizarre thing about this is that if TikTok is forced to be sold, the few people who might be able to buy them might be Facebook or Twitter or Google or YouTube. And already the people who love antitrust are saying, oh no, we'll sue. We're not going to let any big tech company buy this other big tech company. Well, then what do you do to the value? And the thing is TikTok has this amazing value, and you can see a Facebook wanting to buy them. But if I tell you that you work for Facebook, that your competitor is now going to go out of business, and they're going to go out of business in 6 months, why don't you wait and offer them money on 5 months and 30 days or 5 months and 29 days? Get it for a song as they're being forced out of business. You steal people's value. It's an absolute taking by the federal government to set this date. People are saying, oh, it's more reasonable to be a year. Yeah, have you seen a trillion or a multi-billion-dollar deal be done in a year? I mean, a year would be a really fast negotiation. So no, this is absolutely a taking, and I hope the federal government, the court system will strike it down.
So I have a couple quick questions for you before we go. First, part of this whole deal with TikTok was they had a deal with another American company, Oracle, to actually house the data in Texas. I believe they called it Project Texas. And I believe Oracle has contracts with the Pentagon, the Air Force, with all the armed services and intelligence communities. So if we're saying that Oracle is good enough to house that data, what was the problem with Oracle housing all of this other data of 14-year-olds dancing? It seems to me like if they could be trusted with our most valuable assets, why can't they be trusted with this data?
It was completely irrational and hysteric reaction by people who just have this nutty, crazy desire to bash China and do something about China. But if you look at it, TikTok went through a process. It's called CFIUS. And this process is a national security process. In fact, there are other companies in our country that are owned, other companies that are owned by the Chinese investors. What they do is people say, well, we're worried about this. Will you set up an American board? And they have all of these requirements. TikTok's been willing to do every step of that, including, like you say, set up in America all their data housed by Oracle. And at every step, it's all been ignored. And all they say is someday China could steal this data, or the algorithms in China, or all this stuff. And there really hasn't been a very reasonable discussion of this. And it's too bad there's not a two-party system where there's an opposition party. The opposition's largely been me and a handful of people in the House who have stood up for the First Amendment on this. But I've tried to tell the California senators that realize Apple could be next. I've told Apple this. I've called them up and said, you could be next. You need to step up and defend and oppose this bill. But corporations are funny. They're like, they're corporations by nature are timid and don't like to get involved in politics. And I'm not saying it's a great thing, but you got to defend yourselves against people in government who will come and take your stuff. And I think that's what's going to happen to TikTok, or is happening to TikTok. But I think there's a great danger for any other international corporation. Look, Microsoft does business in China too. What big tech company doesn't do business in China? I would be very worried that they may be after you next.
So final question for you, Senator, and this, you mentioned the Uniparty, you mentioned some of these other, as the hysteria builds up, government just grows. But when I look at who's using TikTok, this is this youngest generation that is a voting generation right now. This is this Generation Z, who overwhelmingly, this is their preferred platform. And I saw by Gallup that 52% of this generation now call themselves independent. Only 17% call themselves Republican. Is this type of policy is what driving this generation away from the Uniparty to being independent?
I think so. And really, if you look at initially, Donald Trump wanted to ban TikTok, then he kind of changed his mind. Biden sort of he's on TikTok. He's friendly to TikTok. He invites them to White House, but then he says he's going to sign this. I think it'll be muddled. And I think what's going to happen to the youth vote has been going Democrat for decades, really. I think what's going to happen is a lot of young people are going to sit this one out. I think they have varying opinions on things like the Middle East and what's going on in Gaza. And they also have varying opinions on TikTok. And I think what you're going to see is a lot of young people sit this out, but that disproportionately hurts the Democrats. I wish we had stronger leadership that would stand up. I hope Donald Trump will stand up even stronger in opposition to this, but he's been on both sides of the issue, so I think it makes it hard for him. I think Biden's going to try to have it both ways by not signing this and not having it occur. I think in all likelihood, the clock starts ticking after the election, and it won't happen. You know, they won't ban or shut down TikTok till after the election, and hopefully there'll be some court cases that will reverse this. But Biden wants it both ways. He's going to continue to have relations with TikTok while signing a bill to ban it.
Well, we're out of time, Senator, but look, I have to give you that. First of all, thank you very much for standing up to the Uniparty in Washington. There's not very many who do. And then also, I just want to appreciate, whether it was on COVID or on this issue here, you do have a very calm, slow, deliberate, thoughtful approach that I wish that I was taught with Schoolhouse Rock. That's how Washington was supposed to work. We were supposed to take our time, not legislate in a panic, and actually understand the issues and what's at stake and think in the long run, not just what hysteria is at the moment. And those are two things that when I think about a person here in Washington, your courage and your leadership and your thoughtfulness, I'm sure everyone who's watching really appreciates.
Well, I want to compliment FreedomWorks and particularly John Tamny for the article where he wrote, you know, we don't criticize or condemn Chinese authoritarians by becoming authoritarians ourselves. China bans TikTok. Why would we want to be like China by banning speech in our country? So I think FreedomWorks has been good for freedom of speech, First Amendment, and the defense. And I compliment FreedomWorks for what you guys have been doing.